In the summer of 1914, the war that had promised swift resolution was already sliding into a grim, grinding reality. The front lines, like rivers of mud, had frozen into place, and the soldiers trapped within them were left to watch the world outside become a blurred, distant memory. The trenches stretched for miles, narrow, sodden paths through no man's land, where men huddled in filth, listening to the whine of shells overhead, counting each day as it passed in a haze of tension and dread. The rhythm of the war had slowed, like the steady drip of water down a cliff face. There was no movement, only the constant, oppressive weight of waiting. Life in the trenches was a kind of suspension. The men were neither alive nor dead, but caught in a world where the only certainty was suffering. At night, the enemy's artillery would crack the sky open, and in the half-light of dawn, the soldiers would wonder if anything had changed. Perhaps a few yards of ground had been gained or lost, but the war, with its vast, invisible forces, seemed impervious to their efforts. Every charge, every death, felt like a repetition of the last. The land was scarred and barren, a permanent wound, and above, the sky offered no reprieve. It was as if the very air had become as thick and heavy as the mud underfoot. In this stasis, the soldiers' desperation grew. It was not the fighting that exhausted them, but the endlessness, the hollow, oppressive silence that stretched on, unyielding. Yet in the stillness there was also a certain madness. The fear of death was overshadowed only by the fear of being forgotten. The front had become a waiting room for oblivion, where soldiers would live or die, not by their own choosing, but by the whims of war, a cold, indifferent force. In this world, even hope had been buried beneath the weight of inevitability. In Paris, the mood was different. The French High Command, secure in its long history of military tradition, believed firmly that they had a grasp on the war. They had prepared for battle in the only way they knew, by relying on proven tactics and the time-honored discipline of their army. There was a belief, almost a quiet arrogance, that the old ways of warfare, heavy artillery, massed infantry charges, and the defense of entrenched positions would ultimately prevail. The generals clung to the notion that this war would be like all others they had fought before. The field manuals, written in a different time, were still their guide. The strategy was simple, familiar: wait, hold the line, and counterattack when the time was right. This confidence was not just in their methods, but in the very idea of France's military superiority. The great victories of the past seemed to echo in every decision. The French had long been the leaders of European warfare, and surely, they reasoned, such an institution could not be bested by the machinations of the Germans or the Austrians. There was comfort in the predictability of tradition, a sense that nothing had truly changed. But beneath the surface, in the endless trenches stretching across the landscape, a different story was unfolding, one that would prove tradition no match for the horrors of modern warfare. In the shadow of the stagnant front lines, a quiet revolution was unfolding, one that would alter the course of the war in ways unimaginable to the generals entrenched in tradition. The birth of wireless communication was not the result of a sudden inspiration or a single, grand discovery. It was the culmination of years of experimentation, of tinkering with the invisible currents of radio waves that surged through the air, unnoticed by those caught in the brutal grind of trench warfare. Yet, for all its quiet beginnings, wireless communication held the potential to change everything. The idea was simple in theory, yet audacious in practice: the ability to send messages across the battlefield without the need for wires, which had so often been cut, buried, or destroyed in the chaos of war. This technology could carry orders, relay intelligence, and coordinate forces in real time, removing the limitations of fixed communication lines. It seemed almost too good to be true, yet the potential was undeniable. For the first time in history, it would be possible to speak directly to commanders, no matter where they were, from the depths of the trenches to the farthest reaches of the front. As early as 1914, engineers and inventors had begun to explore the possibilities of radio communication. In makeshift laboratories and remote workshops, the technology was refined. Yet, despite its promising capabilities, it remained a rare and fragile tool. The radios were cumbersome, prone to failure, and difficult to operate. Even so, they offered a tantalizing glimpse into a future where the battlefront could be linked by invisible threads, allowing for a flexibility and coordination never before possible. The idea that men could speak across the battlefield from one unit to another was like something out of a science fiction story. But it was no longer just a dream. The technology was here. The shift was not just technological but philosophical. Wireless communication represented a dynamic change in warfare, a movement away from the static, immobile nature of trench warfare. For the first time, commanders might control the battlefield not from a fixed position, but from anywhere, tapping into the pulse of the front with the touch of a button, the turn of a dial. A weapon that fought with speed, precision, and immediacy. It was a whisper in the wind, a revolution carried on the airwaves, waiting to disrupt the course of the war. But as the technology began to show promise, the French High Command remained unmoved. To the military leaders, wireless communication was, at best, an unproven curiosity. At worst, a distraction. They had seen many new inventions come and go, each hailed as the next great leap forward, only to be forgotten or dismissed. Radios, with their crackling, static, and unreliable signals, seemed no different. The generals clung to their traditional methods, to the systems that had shaped warfare for centuries. In their eyes, communication was best left in the hands of messengers and fixed telephone lines. The noise of the battlefield was enough without adding the complexity of new technology that, to them, lacked proven value. Their reluctance to adopt wireless radios was not simply about technical issues. It was rooted in a deeper resistance to change. The French military's culture was one of stability, tradition, and hierarchy. The very idea that something so ephemeral, something invisible, could replace the tried and true methods of warfare was, in their minds, ludicrous. To rely on radios would be to abandon a century of military doctrine. It was not simply skepticism. It was a profound, institutional distrust of the new. The High Command believed that victory could be won with what they knew, not with what had yet to be proven. The possibility of real-time communication across vast stretches of the battlefield was dismissed as impractical. The old way would hold, they believed, because it always had. In this refusal to embrace the future, there was an irony that would only reveal itself in time. The very hesitation that would allow the war to continue its brutal stagnation, to drag on in blood and misery, would, in retrospect, be seen as the French military's greatest misstep. For while the wheels of progress turned slowly, they were turning. And in that silence, that reluctance, the seeds of the coming transformation were being planted. But for now, the generals in their grand rooms remained deaf to the whispers of progress, caught in the stillness of tradition, even as the world around them began to shift. The summer of 1914 had already ushered in the horrors of modern warfare, but the darkest chapter had yet to unfold. The German Empire, having carefully orchestrated a strategy for a swift victory on the Western Front, was about to make its move. The looming German advance toward Paris cast a long shadow over the French defences. It was the kind of moment that history would look back on as a critical juncture, a moment where the war's very outcome hung in the balance. The Germans had broken through the French lines, pushing hard toward the heart of France. The Great War had become a stalemate of attrition, a grinding deadlock of trench warfare, but now the enemy was on the march, threatening to change everything. The French command found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to react as the Germans encircled Paris. The city, once teeming with life and culture, stood vulnerable under the weight of war's iron grip. There was no room for error. Every decision now had the weight of 1,000 lives. Every order sent over the lines was crucial. The French knew that if Paris fell, so too might France itself. Anxiety gripped the air. This was not just another battle. This was the storm that could break the war wide open. The German forces were advancing with ruthless precision. The pressure was unrelenting, and the French army, despite their own tenacity, felt the suffocating weight of the moment. What had once been a distant possibility, the collapse of their defenses, was now an all-too-real threat. It was a time when fortunes could be made or lost in the blink of an eye. The hours ahead would decide the future of Europe itself. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension in the trenches was palpable as the world held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. In the midst of mounting chaos, there was one unexpected spark of hope: the wireless radios. It was on the eve of the First Battle of the Marne, when all seemed lost, that the French army would, for the first time, put the emerging technology to the test. The radios had been dismissed for months, their potential underestimated, but the urgency of the situation had forced the French to reconsider. The untested radios were quickly brought to the front lines, where they would face their baptism by fire. For the first time in history, a military command post could communicate directly with the front line in real time, bypassing the limitations of wires that had so often been severed in the madness of battle. There was no more waiting for couriers to return with word from the front.
No more delay.
Messages could be transmitted over the air, reaching commanders instantly, allowing them to respond with unprecedented speed. The results were immediate. A new kind of warfare was unfolding. At first, it was clumsy. The technology was still in its infancy, and the radios were temperamental. But despite the challenges, the breakthrough was undeniable. For the first time, commanders on the front lines could coordinate attacks in real time, direct reserves, and reposition forces without the delays and miscommunications that had haunted the past. The French military had unlocked a new power, the ability to move and adapt in a way that was unimaginable just days before. The radios had bridged the gap between stagnation and strategy, and with that bridge, they began to shift the balance of the war. What was once an afterthought, a mere curiosity, had now become the key to coordinating a successful counter-offensive. The first use of wireless radios in battle was a turning point, not just in the conflict at hand, but in the very fabric of warfare itself. It was the beginning of a transformation that would redefine communication in war. The silent waves that carried their messages across the battlefield had shattered the old ways, and with that first transmission a new era began, despite the promise of revolution. The early days of wireless communication on the battlefield were far from smooth. The radios that had been hailed as the key to French success at the Marne now faced their own set of challenges. What had once been seen as the technological marvel of war soon revealed its imperfections, much to the frustration of the soldiers on the front lines. The radios, bulky and temperamental, often sputtered to life with a crackle, only to drop out at the most critical moments. Static, the maddening hum of interference, became an all-too-familiar companion. For every clear message sent, there were three that vanished into the ether, lost to the chaos of the battlefield. The men manning the radios, who had been trained with the best of intentions, quickly learned the stark reality of wartime innovation. Communication, once a simple matter of word of mouth or written orders, had now become an art of deciphering distorted signals. At times, all that could be heard was a mixture of garbled voices and unintelligible sounds, creating a sense of isolation and helplessness that only added to the soldiers' already overwhelming sense of anxiety. In this new war, the clarity that was needed to coordinate strikes or reposition forces was often drowned out by the hum of failure. The system was new, the technology untested, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The men, who had once relied on direct commands and messengers on horseback, were now tasked with understanding a whole new language of communication. The The radio was a tool not just of progress, but of trial and error. The soldiers who manned these machines were not engineers, nor were they particularly prepared for the role they had been thrust into. Yet through frustration and failure they persevered. Every malfunction taught them something new, and with each lesson learned, they drew closer to unlocking the radio's full potential. Innovation, it seemed, was as much about enduring failure as it was about achieving success. And then, after the countless failures, came the breakthrough moment. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the midst of a crucial operation. The radio crackled to life, this time without interference. A message came through, clear and concise, as if the technology had finally found its rhythm amidst the chaos. For the first time, the French command could speak directly to their forces, issuing orders in real time, no longer bound by the delays of couriers or messengers. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, or the realization that, despite all odds, the new system could work. With this breakthrough, the battlefield began to change in subtle but profound ways. Units that had once been isolated, fighting on their own against a ruthless enemy, could now coordinate with precision. Soldiers in the trenches no longer had to wait for word from higher command. They could communicate directly with their superiors, updating their positions and receiving orders almost instantaneously. For the first time, the fog of war began to lift. The simplicity of the solution was almost breathtaking. All it took was a signal transmitted through the air to make real-time coordination possible, and yet it had been overlooked for so long. The radios that had seemed so unreliable now proved to be the key to turning the tide of battle. The technology was still in its infancy, and there were many more kinks to work out, but that moment, that first successful communication, was a revelation. It was the dawn of a new era, where distance and delay would no longer control the rhythm of warfare. The radio had shown its true potential, and with it, the very nature of combat was transformed forever. As the battle line stretched across the rolling hills of the Marne, a shift began to take place, not just in the terrain, but in the very nature of the fight itself. The French, now buoyed by their newfound ability to communicate in real time, were preparing for a counter-offensive. For the first time in the war, French command could coordinate multiple units spread across vast distances without the hindrance of delayed orders or the fog of miscommunication. In the past, reserves were kept in the dark, waiting for orders that could take hours to reach them. Now, with wireless radios at their disposal, the French could call on these reserves with startling speed, repositioning them at critical moments. The change was tangible. The French soldiers, weary but determined, could feel the difference. As they received their orders swiftly and directly, a sense of clarity and purpose spread among them. Units which once fought without a clear understanding of the greater strategy could now see their place within a larger plan. The long-held belief that victory could only come through the sheer weight of attrition was slowly giving way to something far more precise. The ability to move reserves at will, to shift battalions in response to the enemy's movements, was allowing the French to take the initiative in a way they had never before been able to. This counter-offensive, made possible by the use of wireless radios, marked the first true shift in momentum. The French were no longer on the defensive. They were taking the fight to the Germans, pushing them back with an efficiency that had previously seemed impossible. The sense of desperation that had plagued the French forces began to lift, replaced by the quiet optimism that comes from seeing a plan finally take shape. The war, which had once seemed static and unyielding, was now in motion, and the French were leading the charge. The full weight of the new technology became unmistakably clear in those crucial days of the Marne. For the first time in the war, decision-making was not constrained by the slow pace of couriers or outdated communication systems. French commanders, once limited by the need for physical messengers, could now issue orders in real time, adjusting tactics as the battle unfolded. This newfound ability to respond instantaneously was a game changer. not just in terms of logistics, but in terms of strategy as the counter-offensive took shape. French commanders used their radios to adjust plans on the fly. When an enemy breakthrough was detected, they could immediately call in reinforcements to plug the gap, shifting the tide in minutes. If a particular attack wasn't working, they could redirect troops to a more vulnerable sector without waiting for orders to filter through the command chain. It was a level of speed and efficiency that had never been seen before. The ability to adapt, to shift tactics with such immediacy, transformed the battlefield from a static, entrenched war of attrition into something far more dynamic. For the soldiers, this new form of warfare was both exhilarating and daunting. They could sense the difference. What had once been a slow, grinding process of offense and retreat was now a fluid, responsive battle driven by the power of real-time communication. Decisions were no longer tentative or delayed. They were immediate, and their consequences were immediate as well. As the French forces pushed back the German lines, the radios continued to hum with activity. The messages coming through now were not pleas for reinforcements, but commands for further action. The tide of war, once so firmly in the hands of the Germans, was beginning to shift. The ability to coordinate movements instantly had turned the tables in ways that no one could have predicted. And it was all thanks to a technology that had once been viewed with skepticism. The war was changing, and with it the future of combat itself. While the battlefield at the Marne shifted in favor of the French, the highest echelons of military command remained remarkably resistant to change. The French army's senior commanders, entrenched in their traditional strategies and methods, continued to view wireless communication with skepticism, if not outright disdain. Though the radios had proved their worth on the front lines, allowing real-time coordination of troops, the establishment remained cautious. For them, innovation was a threat to the time-tested methods that had guided France through countless wars. The old guard was not ready to embrace the future, clinging to the belief that warfare was best fought with what they knew best, established tactics and well-honed skills, not newfangled technology. This hesitance created an undercurrent of frustration for the younger officers, many of whom had witnessed firsthand the potential of wireless communication in battle. It was clear to them that this new tool was not just an advantage, but a necessity. Yet their superiors resisted, unwilling to fully integrate the radios into their command structure. The irony was palpable. The very technology that had helped win the battle was being ignored by the very people who could ensure it was used most effectively in the future. The old guard's reluctance to embrace wireless communication wasn't just an issue of tradition, it was a barrier to further innovation. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly clear that those who failed to adapt would be left behind. But for now, progress remained slow, and the battlefield was still as much about hierarchy and outdated tactics as it was about technological advancements. Despite the stubborn resistance of the senior command, the outcome of the First Battle of the Marne would be one of undeniable change. The victory, while not without its costs, marked a definitive turning point in World War I. The French forces, thanks in no small part to the use of wireless communication, had managed to turn the tide against the German army. The Germans, who had been advancing at a relentless pace, were now retreating, their dreams of a swift victory crushed. In the days that followed, the full scale of the victory became apparent. The Marne was not just a tactical win, it was a symbolic one. The French had been able to execute real-time, coordinated movements on the battlefield, a feat that had been impossible before the advent of wireless technology. It was the culmination of a long struggle, one in which old and new tradition and progress had collided. But the triumph was bittersweet. The victory at the Marne had come at a heavy cost. Thousands of soldiers had given their lives, and much of the land had been destroyed. The battlefield was a grim reminder of the stakes, even as the outcome shifted in favor of the French. The old guard, having witnessed the success of the new communication methods, could no longer deny their importance. But the victory was tainted by the irony of how long it had taken to accept them. The Marne would go down in history as a crucial moment, a battle that had not only saved France from defeat, but had also changed the very nature of warfare. Wireless communication had proven its worth, transforming the battlefield from a chaotic, static struggle into a dynamic, responsive environment. It was a victory made possible by the technology that so many had resisted. The cost was steep, but in the end, the battlefield had been reshaped forever. And with it, the future of military operations. The shift was complete. The war would never be the same again. And while the old guard might have been slow to adapt, the innovations born of necessity would continue to drive the future of warfare. The dust had settled at the Marne, and the French had secured a pivotal victory, but the true cost of that triumph could only be measured over time. The battlefield, now scarred by trenches and ruins, symbolized not just the sacrifices made, but the painful birth of a new era. The victory had been hard-earned, with lives lost and resources spent, but one of its lasting legacies would be the permanent introduction of wireless communication into warfare. In the aftermath, the significance of what had been achieved slowly began to crystallize. The radios that had once been met with skepticism were now seen as indispensable tools, revolutionizing how military forces communicated and coordinated. No longer would officers be constrained by the slow, cumbersome process of sending orders via runners or signal flags. Wireless communication allowed for a dynamic battlefield, where decisions could be made in real time, bridging the gaps that had once left armies isolated and vulnerable. Yet the weight of that advancement lingered. The technology that had proven so effective came at a cost. The reluctance to adapt, the human lives lost before that adaptation could be fully realized, and the deep struggle between tradition and progress. Even as the war progressed, the memory of that resistance haunted the halls of command. The Marne's victory had been one of technological necessity, but it was also a victory steeped in the shadow of delay. It was a quiet reflection on the painful paradox of war. Progress often emerges from tragedy, but that progress doesn't erase the cost of the past. The Marne was a moment of triumph, yes, but also a moment that marked the beginning of a profound transformation, one that would redefine the future of warfare. The Marne marked the first true realization of wireless technology's potential in combat, but its impact rippled far beyond the trenches of World War I. From that point on, wireless communication became a cornerstone of modern military operations, fundamentally changing how armies fought and coordinated. As the years went on, the influence of wireless radios spread throughout military strategies around the world. In World War II, the rapid coordination of forces would become a key advantage for the Allies, with radios playing a pivotal role in both large-scale operations and small unit tactics. The concept of command and control that had the ability to lead and direct troops at a distance in real time evolved from a distant dream to a practical necessity. Battles became faster, more fluid, and far more unpredictable as information could flow freely across vast distances, shifting the tide of conflict in the blink of an eye. By the time the Cold War arrived, wireless communication had become so integral that the thought of warfare without it seemed almost inconceivable. Satellites, radar, and secure encrypted communications would take the groundwork laid at the Marne to unimaginable heights, enabling military operations on a global scale. Yet, the quiet revolution began with a simple set of radios that transmitted through the air. Technology once dismissed, now shaping the very fabric of modern warfare. The radios of the Marne had been the silent architects of a new military world, setting in motion the future of how wars would be fought, won, and remembered. Looking back, it's hard to overstate how a single technological breakthrough, one that came under the shadow of skepticism and adversity, could alter the course of history. Wireless communication, in its infancy during the Marne, had irrevocably changed the nature of battle, and with it, the very essence of military strategy. That change had come quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it would echo across every conflict that followed. As the years passed, the men who fought at the Marne and the technology they used faded into history. But their legacy, that first quiet revolution in communication, would live on. The future of warfare had been transformed, not by the weapons of war, but by the simple act of connecting voices, thoughts, and strategies across the airwaves. The echoes of that progress still resonate today, as the world continues to navigate the complex relationship between technology, war, and humanity.